Welcome back, everyone, to Ye Olde Guide, the ultimate podcast companion for unravelling the history of England's towns and cities. I'm Liam McGrath, and along with my co-host, historian Daniel Gooch, today we delve into the intriguing city of Stoke-on-Trent. Now, Stoke-on-Trent is a name that conjures images of pottery, industry, and perhaps a cold evening of football. Stoke is a polycentric agglomeration of 6 towns. And if you find yourself confused by this unique arrangement, fear not. This episode will explain all. Now it's time to introduce my co-host, the one and only urban history aficionado, Daniel Gooch. And how have you been, Daniel?
I've been very well. I think I've gone back to work after parental leave since we last recorded one of these. Getting back into that. Looking forward to recording another episode. Stoke was a really interesting place to visit. Very successful for us. A good victory at Port Vale for Ipswich Town, and successful end to the season for us as well.
Well, of course, you couldn't possibly start the podcast without mentioning the success of Ipswich Town Football Club's promotion. But we won't bore all our listeners.
Give it another 23 years till it happens again. That's how long we've had to wait for this one.
Brilliant. We couldn't possibly get through an episode without mentioning football. And we'll be coming back to football, actually, because we will be exploring Stoke in 5 categories, as we always do. In each category, we give a score, reflecting how interesting we found the history and how much of it is left today. We love it when listeners get in touch with the podcast. So if we've missed something in this episode, or we got something wrong, or you just want to say hi, please visit our website, yeoldeguide.com. So now to get on with it, Stoke-on-Trent. Well, Stoke-on-Trent is a large city of around 270,000 people. It's in Staffordshire, located about halfway between Manchester and Birmingham. It's located in the southwest foothills of the Pennines, east of the Cheshire Plains, so it's kind of got rolling hills landscape. Unsurprisingly, the River Trent runs through the city, but it's close to the source, so it's not really a dominant feature. The built-up area is somewhat larger than the city we're discussing because Newcastle-under-Lyme and Kidsgrove are contiguous with the city, but they're not in Stoke-on-Trent. We'll come back to that. The region has become known as the Potteries. Reasons for that will become obvious when we talk about the industry of Stoke-on-Trent. All right, Daniel, let's start with explaining this polycentric city business.
I suppose the first thing you have to think about is the area of Stoke, what it looks like. It covers a very large area, about 10 miles long, 4 miles wide, and it's unique because while every other English city you can think of is, by contrast, radial in its layout, by which I mean it stretches out concentrically almost from a defined centre, Stoke is linear. Its urban centres run along a line across this 10 mile long by 4 miles wide urban sprawl, really. And it has several small to medium sized urban hubs, which result from the 6 towns from which the federated city of Stoke-on-Trent was formed. This group of 6 towns, previously villages, are Stoke, Hanley, Tunstall, Longton, Fenton and Burslem. So while Stoke-on-Trent as a unified city is only about 100 years old, if we're going to talk about its history, we need to talk today more specifically about the history of the 6 towns of Stoke in their own right, as well as the city as a unified whole. While these separate urban settlements did exist as really small villages for hundreds of years, Burslem for one is mentioned in the Domesday Book, it was only after the dawn of industrialisation that they started to grow into larger towns and new urban districts. This was a period of very rapid growth, and the city as a whole, though it wasn't quite federated as one city of Stoke-on-Trent, was, if you look at its area that it covers today, one of the 15 biggest towns in the country by population by 1850. Only 3 other towns in the preceding century had risen in a similar way. So Stoke really does owe its growth and importance and in size to industrialisation. And while there were many different industries in the area making use of the local coal supplies, the one industry on which Stoke most depended was pottery, from which the area derives its nickname, the Potteries. Industrialists like famously Josiah Wedgwood built on the existing domestic pottery industry and started mass production under a factory system, and he came to dominate the British pottery market until really from the late 18th century onwards. But Stoke-on-Trent as a unified city properly came into existence in 1910 with the federation of these 6 separate towns into a single county borough. This, as it happened in 1910, and then 1925, this area was granted city status. This federation of 6, several distinct towns into one single major urban conurbation was an absolutely unique event in British history, and as we're going to see today, really has shaped the city as you experience it today.
That's a great overview, Daniel, and I think it's worth saying, it's really emphasising that these 6 towns are genuinely separate. They're separated by about 2 miles between them, continuously built up, but it's not like we're talking about different districts of a city centre. They are genuinely different towns with slightly different characters, and they've each got a town hall and a market square. And just a reminder, running north to south, just so we're really clear, we've got the north, we've got Tunstall, then Burslem, then Hanley, Stoke-on-Trent, from which the city takes its name, Fenton, and Longton, going north to south. That leads us nicely onto our first category. We call politics and war. Don't think there's much about war in this category today. So let's talk about the politics. Let's talk about this confederation of the town and the political history behind it.
I definitely think we should expand on that, because that is probably the most obviously unique point about Stoke, its federated nature. And I just want to repeat what you said. They really do feel like 6 distinct towns more than one unified city. And the political story behind this really is equally unique. There are geological aspects to this. 5 of the 6 towns were developed up on hills or promontories over the deposits of coal that kick-started the area's industrialisation. And the towns are laid out on that 10-mile-long stretch, kind of from Langton to Tunstall. George Bradshaw in 1863 described this as one long street from which the separate towns emerge just as suburbs of the road, it seems. So that gives you some kind of impression of how it felt then. And even though the areas in between is a bit more built up today, I think you could probably say the same thing. I'd walked some of that distance when I arrived in Stoke, and it does feel like you're walking between separate towns when you're doing it. But despite their independent characters, the federation of the towns didn't just come out of nowhere. There seems to have been some cultural acceptance of their links previously. I found a Gazetteer entry from the 1870s which described Hanley, even at that point, 40 years before Federation, as a sub-district in Stoke-on-Trent district, Stafford, and treating the Potteries as a single area worthy of its own, albeit brief, entry. And on a political level, Federation had been discussed since the Great Reform Act of 1833 had given the region its first MPs, and it was driven partly by the need to take a unified approach in providing public services and amenities for the growing population of the area. But despite this, there was concern, particularly in the oldest town, Burslem, about the separate areas losing their independence of character. Each town had grown independently and had the political and architectural manifestations of political autonomy in their own civic functions, their own councils, and even their own multiple town halls. The rivalry between Hanley and Burslem was reflected in the writings of Arnold Bennett, Stoke's most famous writer, who we'll come on to talk more about later. But despite these parochial reservations, Federation did happen, and the new city took its name from the constituent town of Stoke, because while Stoke-on-Trent wasn't and still isn't at all the largest of the towns, it was the original ancient parish. The other areas were subdivisions of this. So the administrative centre of the new federation was located in Stoke-upon-Trent, as was and still is the main railway station. And that's really how the federated city of Stoke-on-Trent came to be.
It's remarkable quite how much debate there was about this in the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, and a lot of it was about property taxes as well. But we've ended up with the 6 towns as one. Now, I mentioned in the intro that Newcastle-under-Lyme is effectively joined on to Stoke, but it's outside of the Confederation. It never joined, and there's still news articles today. I did a quick reading the local press in Staffordshire, and it's still a hot topic of conversation. Should Newcastle-under-Lyme be in Stoke-on-Trent? No, I think they don't want to be, really.
I think there was, it came not that far off annexation quite early on annexation, I call it. Joining the Federation is probably a better way of putting it. In 1919, but it never happened because Newcastle's civic authorities objected so strongly. And the other point about Newcastle is it never really had any involvement in the pottery industry. So it did retain this kind of separate industry and separate culture, as well as its own government.
Yeah, no, that's right. Very different character. But you get that all over the land, the major conurbations, places like Epsom not wanting to be in London, but, just on the outside. So what about other areas of political history, or have we got any evidence of battles or conflict in the Stoke-on-Trent area?
There's not really anything to say about battles in the traditional sense, not even our usual mention of the Civil War, which gets into every episode. Really because as Stoke only really started to become a developed urban area from the Industrial Revolution, it kind of missed the boat for these things. But one military connection that Stoke does do a good job of celebrating is that of Reginald Joseph Mitchell, who was the designer of the Spitfire. He was raised in Stoke and got his first job at a local railway engineering works, studied maths and engineering at a local college. So he got his design, his engineering, his scientific background and education in the city. And although I'm sure we have mentioned Spitfires before, I think we might have mentioned them in the Swindon episode a long time ago, Stoke does do a very good job of celebrating this link through its very own Spitfire, which is on display in the city's main museum. And it has a fairly sizable gallery attached. So there's definitely some credit to the city for that. Reginald Mitchell actually died before the Second World War even began in 1937. So he never got to see the aeroplane in action in the war or see it become this great symbol of British resistance in the Battle of Britain. As many will know, Spitfires in the Battle of Britain were outnumbered by Hawker Hurricanes, but the Spitfires were generally more successful in air battles. Mitchell specifically is still remembered today in Stoke, not just in the Spitfire Gallery, but in the Mitchell Arts Centre and in a statue in Hanley.
The Spitfire does occupy an important symbolic place in British history, and so it is important. A good connection with modern warfare. But you've also identified the importance of Stoke in some of the political history of Victorian era and Chartism and the riots and in the general strike of 1842.
Yeah, I think this kind of almost crosses the threshold between battles and politics. Is perfect for this category. It's the 1842 Pottery riots. These happened, as you said, during the 1842 general strikes, and were provoked by one mine owner's refusal to give proper notice, as he was required to by law, of a pay reduction. The affected coal workers in Stoke went on strike, and others around them in the area went on strike in solidarity, and it built up to a mass protest of thousands until on the 16th of August, the Riot Act was read. There was a confrontation in Burslem between about 5,000 protesters and I think about 50 troops, which resulted in the troops firing on the protesters. One teenager was killed, several others were wounded, and rioting resulted, which was directed in particular against figures of authority like magistrates and local mine owners. Many of the rioters were eventually rounded up. 200 of them were either imprisoned or transported to Australia. But this is still seen as an important moment in the history of organised protest and trades unionism in Britain. The teenager who was killed has a plaque in his memory in Swan Square in Stoke, and he had a street named after him in Burslem last year. Unfortunately, it was given the wrong name. It was called Joseph Heapy Close rather than his actual name, Josiah Heapy Close. But they do seem, if you look on Google Maps, to have corrected the mistake since then.
Oh dear, someone will be getting a telling off, but they won't be getting a pay reduction. Did you say pay reduction? Did you say the mine owners wanted to do a pay reduction?
Yeah, didn't give the required notice.
Oh, wow. And that was all part of the period of, that working class movement of Chartism, which basically wanted more people to have the right to vote.
Yep.
And in the end, we got the things they wanted. Apart from annual general elections, that would have been a terrible idea. Imagine having a general election every year.
Sounds expensive.
All right, I think we're at the point of scoring. This is the bit where we give a score.
Probably fair to say nothing world-changing has happened here. And Stoke's youth means it has, as I said, missed the boat for any major military action. But this unique political event of its federation, which has never been replicated since in this country, I think it does imbue the city today, as you experience it, with a unique quality. It's a polycentric city in fact as well as in principle, so this gains at some points. I'm going to give it a 3 out of 10.
My only question to it, giving it that identity, I wonder if it hadn't been confederated, if it just stayed as 6 separate towns, would it made much difference? I mean, I agree with you. I don't think there's much. The Pottery riots were an important event, so I think for me it's a 3. Our second category is science and industry. And really, Daniel, Stoke has been dominated by one industry.
There's really only one place we can start here, which is with pottery. Archaeological and court records show that the pottery industry in Stoke goes back to the 14th century at least. And this was initially a domestic industry. Production occurred in the home, particularly in the homes of Burslem. This was simply pottery produced in outhouses and kilns attached to cottages. This was common in Stoke, partly because the soil in this area was too poor to grow agricultural products well, in part because of the coal that much of Stoke sits on. So the poor used to just supplement their income by producing pottery at home. But as with so much manufacturing work, the advent of the factory system, and here in particular, Josiah Wedgwood's opening of his famous factory in Etruria, which he named after the area of Italy known for its ancient vases, changed all this. These new factories were also close to windmills and water wheels, which in the years before steam engines could be used for grinding raw clay and other materials, which had been a problem in production for domestic producers, and in this way helped increase the quality of product. But then manufacturers began harnessing steam power also to produce purer clay ingredients and mechanise the shaping of products, while transport developments gave them access to a much wider range of clay, stone and china from around the country. So there was more choice in the finished product. But the mechanised process still required human creativity. I think it must have been a really fascinating blend of industry and artistry. And Wedgwood is probably the most famous name associated with Stoke pottery, and he did marry industry and creativity perfectly. He was especially famous for his creamware, which is cream-coloured pottery covered with a lead glaze, which was produced en masse at his first factory in the centre of Burslem, next to the town hall. But as well as his own products, Wedgwood also helped open markets for Stoke's industry by helping to get the Trent and Mersey Canal built in the 1770s to transport his, and of course others, products further afield, which opened up national and international markets. This high demand meant all potters who had previously had to sell their wares locally and at trade fairs could now ship out to wider markets. Wedgwood himself sold to London and then internationally through ports like Liverpool. And it wasn't just Wedgwood, nor just kitchenware and crockery that came out of Stoke's pottery industry. The Minton factory produced tiles en masse for some of the most famous buildings in the world. The Houses of Parliament, which needed 75,000 tiles, the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., the Victoria and Albert Museum, and the American National Portrait Gallery are just some. And thanks to all this, Stoke and its environs dominated the British pottery industry by the late 18th century, and the industry had a big impact on the population and the character of Stoke. By 1841, the industry's dominance is pretty clear from the fact that 53% of workers in Stoke-on-Trent, that smaller constituent town, 34% of workers in Hanley and 61% in Burslem were employed in pottery. And this is more than comparable with, say, the dominance of textile industries in some Lancashire towns or mining in South Wales. The city's workforce had become a bit more diversified by the early 20th century, but pottery was still a huge employer, with 36% of Stoke's workers employed in the industry in 1929. And as well as employment and the commercial aspects of the town, pottery also dominated the character of the town. George Bradshaw said in 1863, "When the staple manufacture and the people have been thoroughly examined, there is little else attractive in this important quarter." So clearly he thought this was the only thing in Stoke worth paying any attention to, and I interpret from that he's saying this is the only thing that made it important. While most of the pottery industry is now gone, it does still impact Stoke today. Some small niche or artisan potters still remain, while from a tourism perspective, the Wedgwood Visitor Centre is probably the biggest tourist attraction in Stoke, though most of its wares are now produced in Indonesia. But this lack of diversity does bring its problems, mainly via the fact that most tourist visits in Stoke are pretty short, with low spends compared with those in other towns. Basically, people come in, make quick visits for the Wedgwood Centre or something similar, and then leave. But if you are going to go to Stoke, there is more than that to explore. The Gladstone Pottery Museum, in particular, is a great place to go. It's been used as a filming location to represent grimy Victorian factory life, and I think you get a really good sense of factory life in there. Another thing to watch out for are the distinct bottle kilns, which were used to bake pottery products in the early factories and in people's houses. If you see one, you will instantly know what it is. You don't even need to look at a picture of it first. There used to be over 2,000, but government legislation on air quality stopped their use in 1956, and now only 47 all listed remain. You can see some at the Gladstone Pottery Museum. You can see a few in Langton, and they're a really unique factor of Stoke's urban environment.
They are unique, and as time goes on, I suppose they become more charming and important to preserve. You know, at a time when there were 2,000 of them, probably thought nothing of them. I mean, I think this is an element of history. It is still within touching distance, and it's very visible in Stoke across the towns. In Burslem, you've got Moorcroft Pottery. You've got 3 bottle kilns immediately to the south of the market square. In the largest town, Hanley, we've got the Spode Museum, Etruria Museum. Down in Fenton, salt, pepper, vinegar bottle kilns, probably the best thing in Fenton. The Gladstone Pottery Museum you mentioned in Longton. You can go along the succession of towns and see these attractions and those 47 kilns. The town I didn't mention there for anything to see in the pottery industry is Tunstall. Never fear Tunstall, because Tunstall is famous for making the world's largest teapot. The Alfred Meakin Pottery Company made metre-high teacups in the 1890s as a marketing gimmick. Apparently,
have a bath in that.
You could. Well, I think you can stand inside them if you're small.
I'll put my daughter in there next time I go.
Estimated capacity, 800 cups of tea. Wow. There's no question that the potteries do dominate any trip to Stoke if you are visiting. We normally talk about science in this section, and I suppose Josiah Wedgwood did use scientific techniques to develop his pottery. But is there anything beyond pottery we can talk about in terms of scientific innovation?
Very, very brief mention. Oliver Lodge, who was born in Stoke, invented the spark plug. And he was also a key figure in the early development of radio. He was the first person to wirelessly transmit Morse code. And Stanley Matthews, the very famous footballer, who we're going to talk more about later, lived in the same house as him. Not at the same time, of course, much later, but lived in his house. So, yeah, it's thanks to Oliver Lodge that you can start a car and listen to the radio while you're doing it.
Oh, brilliant. Well, that brings us on to the scoring. I'll give Stoke an additional half mark for that little anecdote. So on to the scoring. Well, it's my turn. I'll be brief. I do like all this industrial, the ceramics heritage. I think it's interesting. I think there's museums, there's stuff to see. I think it could go further. I think there could be a bit more to bring it to life, make the trail a bit more clear, maybe a bit more, but still, I do find it a fascinating history, so I shall be giving it a 7.
Oh, not bad at all. Mm-hmm. It's very telling that we've really only spoken about one thing here. Pottery really has dominated Stoke since it started to become a major settlement. Other industries have moved in since. Tyre manufacturing is one, but none has nor ever will come anywhere near replicating the dominance of pottery. Pottery is perhaps sidelined in studies and representations of the Industrial Revolution in favour of industries like textiles, like ironwork. But industrialisation was every bit as important to this industry and the towns such as Stoke that it affected. It's a perfect case study in the impact of industrialisation on an existing local industry and increasing affordability also of commercial luxuries for industrialised Britain. For me, the lack of diversity in what we've been able to talk about keeps the score down here, but Stoke does deserve credit for being an international centre of an important industry, and I think still representing this in its museums and visitor centres today. So I'm going to give it 5.5.
And, it crossed my mind when you were speaking, maybe they could do more to celebrate it. I was looking at the ceramics collection at the Victoria and Albert Museum, which is apparently the largest in the world. I do wonder, maybe that should have been moved to Stoke-on-Trent to add to the collections.
Well, there was another museum next to the town hall in Burslem, but it closed a couple of years ago, I think, from lack of visitor numbers. I don't know if you remember this. It opened, I think, about 20 years ago. I watched an episode of Time Team just before it opened because they were excavating Josiah Wedgwood's first factory next to Burslem Town Hall for the new museum that was going to be on that site. But so yeah, they tried, but it failed, unfortunately.
Our next category is arts and culture. Some decent music's come out of Stoke, hasn't it, Daniel?
Yeah, Stoke's the childhood home of Lemmy from Motorhead and Hawkwind, and
not bad.
Slash from Guns N' Roses.
Oh, wow.
But probably its most its musical progeny with the biggest connection is Robbie Williams, who is from Burslem. He lived in the Red Lion pub in Burslem from the age of 2. It's no longer a pub. It seems most recently to have become an illegal cannabis factory, from what I can tell. Robbie Williams famously loves Port Vale, the football club in Burslem. I remember him causing confusion among millions of boys our age by managing to get them included in FIFA 2000 as a playable club because he provided the game's song, despite the fact that only at that point top-level clubs were generally included. And he played a concert at the club stadium last year. He also recorded a song called Burslem Normals on his album Rude Box in 2006. He mentioned Scotia Road in Tunstall in his song The 80s on the same album. It's also been suggested that Williams' most famous song Angels may have been inspired by the angel on Burslem Town Hall. I can't find any direct evidence for this, and it seems more likely that it came from the subject of the song about death, but there's been a lot of dispute over the songwriting credits for that song, so it's all a little bit murky. He certainly seems loved in Burslem, though. There was a mural in his honour there until recently, and 3 streets have been named after his songs: Supreme Street, Candy Lane and Angels Way. And there's even a Stoke-on-Trent Robbie Williams tourist trail if you want to check all those places out.
I mean, I think the Angels thing is clutching at straws, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean,
that's seeing something that isn't there. Are you a fan of Williams?
I'm fairly indifferent on him. I wouldn't buy one of his albums, but I'd listen to a few of his songs.
Listen to Angels. Would you be happy if it came on?
Well, maybe. My brother sings that in karaoke. It's his favourite karaoke song. It's no one else's when he sings it. Won't mind me saying. Such
is how it goes. Okay, so Robbie Williams. Have we got anyone else that's had a big cultural influence from Stoke or involving Stoke?
Yes, Arnold Bennett, who we mentioned earlier.
Oh, you mentioned him, yeah.
We did, yeah. He probably isn't as famous as he once was, but he is certainly Stoke's most famous novelist. He wrote extensively about Victorian Burslem, and as we mentioned earlier, portrayed the rivalry between Hanley and Burslem in his novels. One of his books, The Card, was adapted for film in 1952 and filmed on location in Burslem. So if you want to see Burslem in the 1950s, there's your opportunity. One interesting point is that Bennett portrayed Stoke as comprising 5 towns rather than 6. He had some excuse as he was setting his works in the 19th century before the Federation of the Towns, so he decided just to miss out the smallest town of Fenton. He was a noted realist writer, realism being an artistic movement from the 19th and 20th centuries, which, as the name suggests, attempted to portray real life in a natural, authentic way. But it does mean he was somewhat pushed aside in popular tastes later by what became the more fashionable modernist movement, which was a kind of anti-realism, really, an attempt to portray feeling and emotion in an abstract way rather than events as they presented themselves on the surface. But nonetheless, he is still known and famous in Stoke today.
Definitely well known. And I'm not surprised he forgot about Fenton.
Yep.
I mean, there's not a lot there, is there?
No, that's right.
Disrespect. No disrespect, but it's definitely it's the least going on of the 6 towns, I'd argue, in Fenton.
That's probably fair.
I'm probably going to get some Fenton Historical Society.
Our first hate mail. You could put that on Twitter and see if the clickbait gets us any.
Sorry, Fenton. I mean, it's got a nice town hall and a nice square in front of the town hall. That's about it. It's just roads. Otherwise, it's just roads. But look, one thing that Stoke-on-Trent did achieve a couple of years back, because it was runner-up in the British City of Culture competition, and it's sort of growing sense of cultural growth in Stoke, and that was really kicked off after this period of decline of the pottery industry. It was really kicked off by the Stoke-on-Trent Garden Festival. Tell us a bit about the Garden Festival.
It was one of the biggest cultural events ever to have happened in Stoke. It was held in 1986. It was Britain's second national garden festival. These were part of a drive to regenerate derelict land in industrial areas of Britain. They were based on a German idea, Bundesgartenschau, which started post-war as a way to redevelop war-damaged land, but are still going in Germany today. There were 5 of these in total in Britain, And Stokes is arguably the one that's physically survived the best, as it's the one that today is the most completely parkland. Yeah. I think it's interesting to give some more historical context to these festivals. They were organised partly as a response to urban crises of the 80s, such as unemployment and inner city rioting, especially in cities like Liverpool, which held the first Garden Festival in 1984. The aim was to attract investment for urban renewal and also to increase local employment opportunities, partly directly with new jobs related to the festival, but also partly in trading and providing new skills. In Stoke itself, 1,020 locally registered unemployed people were given temporary employment for the festival. The festival itself was held on the site of an old steelworks, which had become wasteland and been dug up, mined and worked on for 200 years. This new festival site covered 73 hectares of land, incorporated 200,000 new trees where previously there hadn't really been any. The festival even had its own railway, which unfortunately was taken down afterwards, but the parts have now been divided up between railways in Norfolk and Spain, and it had its own cable car as well. Now, Stoke's festival was not as well attended as the first one in Liverpool, almost the German Bundesgartenschau. It's been said that this is because it wasn't marketed very well and that summer was particularly wet. While the parkland area was nice, there was, it's been said, nothing particularly exciting or new or innovative for people to see there. But it attracted millions of people. It was the country's third most popular paying visitor attraction of the year and helped start the idea of Stoke as a place to visit. Today, the festival site is mostly still there and there is some regular maintenance and upkeep. The car park is now a retail park, as much of the urban sprawl of Stoke today is, but nonetheless, there's still enough there that's left to be worth exploring.
No, very interesting. Look, I know you're a linguist, Daniel. What does Bundesgartenschau mean?
It means Federal Garden Show, kind of national garden show. Think of Bundes as in Bundesliga, National League, Garten as in garden, Schau as in show. You can kind of piece it together and work it out. So
obvious when you spell it out like that. Brilliant. And and they were like in cities that had the crisis. I think there was one at in Welsh valleys, Glasgow.
Yeah.
So those, real. So this was on the old steelworks, Shelton Bar. So a bit of a turning point and still there. One more thing on this category, culture. I don't think we could get through an episode of Ye Olde Guide without mentioning football. We've got two football teams in Stoke. You mentioned Port Vale. You've also got Stoke City. Stoke City was one of the 12 founding members of the Football League, but the only one never to have won it. The clubs haven't been particularly successful, let's be honest, but There has been one exceptionally famous player coming out of Stoke.
Absolutely. Stoke is the birthplace and for most of his life the home of Stanley Matthews, one of the greatest ever footballers. He was born in Stoke, he died in Stoke, he played for Stoke City for 19 years in two different spells, though he actually grew up a Port Vale fan. And as we mentioned earlier, lived in Oliver Lodge's birthplace for a while. He should be a familiar name to most people, but to list some of his achievements, he's the only footballer to have been knighted while still playing. He was the first Ballon d'Or winner for European Player of the Year. He played top division football until he was 50. Though he wasn't a regular starter then, he still did play matches. Pelé himself described Matthews as the man who taught us the way football should be played. Pelé admittedly wasn't exactly slow to dish out adulation, but this is still high praise coming from him. His most famous match, which is known simply as the Matthews Final, the FA Cup final of 1953, is still one of the most famous football matches in history, partly because of the sentimentalism of Matthews finally winning the cup at the age of 38, partly because of how he helped inspire Blackpool, who was playing for at the time, to come back from 3-1 down to win 4-3, but also because it was one of the first televised finals watched by a really large audience, because many people had bought TVs ready for the upcoming coronation of Elizabeth II, and this really helped make the cup final kind of a national television event. Memorabilia from the match sells for a fortune these days, and I once had the privilege of meeting a man who'd actually been at the final, and it was really one of the most interesting conversations I've ever had. And Matthews is still regarded even today as one of the greatest and most important footballers ever to play the game.
And he is celebrated in Stoke. There's a statue of him at the Stoke City football ground, the name of which I've forgotten.
I think it's the Bet365 Stadium these days.
I think you're right. Renowned for being cold.
Yes, I don't think I've ever seen us win there.
Bet365, one of the new businesses to industries, what most successful recent new industries in Stoke. So that's we've had quite a few topics there. Is there anything else you want to cover in culture?
Staffordshire Hoard, we have time to touch on that. This is possibly the most important Anglo-Saxon architectural find ever. Certainly the largest collection of Anglo-Saxon gold ever discovered. And it was actually found in Lichfield in 2009, but part of it is on display in the Pottery's Museum and Art Gallery in Hanley, so I think it just about qualifies here. The hoard was made its constituent parts were made in different parts of the Anglo-Saxon world around 600 AD. It comprises thousands of pieces of martial treasure, mostly weapons, but also fittings from saddles and books, which themselves we no longer have. Most of the hoard was made of silver, but also plenty was made of gold and some of garnet, so it's definitely worth seeing if you're in Stoke. And last thing we can talk about, bit of popular art here. Arnold Machin was born in Stoke. He first learned to paint and sculpt at one of the potteries and then at the Stoke-on-Trent College of Art. And he is responsible for one of the most reproduced pictures in history, which is, yes, you probably have this in your home. Most of us probably have this in our home. The portrait of Elizabeth II used on stamps from 1968 to sort of now, and also across the Commonwealth. So, yeah, one of the most reproduced pieces of art in history. Probably some sitting not too far from all of us as we speak.
Oh, that's a fascinating little stat. You see, I knew there'd be some surprises in this episode. That's fantastic. Well, look, that's great. I think that's enough. I think that rounds off arts and culture category, and it's time to give our scores.
My thoughts, Stoke is a large place with a fairly sizable population. But my question is, does it have the same grandeur, the same buzz of larger cities? Does it feel like the centre of a larger geographical area, like some cities of the same size? And I feel it probably doesn't. And this, again, comes back to its polycentric layout. When researching for this podcast and local people's feelings about it, I read what I can only describe as a nauseatingly pretentious book, which I won't name, about the city, bemoaning the fact the town has no John Lewis, I'm quoting here, no Waitrose, no Pret-a-Manger, no Cafe Nero, no Space NK, whatever that is, no Jigsaw, no Monsoon. And how will the middle classes cope, you wonder? But there is, I have to admit, a kind of point here. There's no one major central cultural hub to the town that these places will buzz around. There are, of course, other ways that cities can become cultural hubs. And there's an idea in academic circles that modern tourism is principally based on a projection of a romanticised fantasy version of a place, which relies really on its depiction in media. Think, for instance, of Constable Country, of Jane Austen's Bath, of the depiction of Wales as a land of castles and dragons. When this happens, I think history is crucial to this, and perhaps the other weakness for Stoke as it relates to this is that none of its diffuse cultural heritage lends itself easily to this fantasy projection. I have read serious suggestions that Arnold Bennett's novels could provide this for Stoke, that what's lacking is a modern, and I quote, sexed up version of his stories. But it's, to my mind, it's hard to imagine works of gritty urban realism providing this. And if anything, his works have become a tad less more obscure in the last few decades. But still, while there's perhaps no unifying cultural hub or theme here, except maybe that gritty realism, there are some interesting and notable cultural achievements that have come out of Stoke. I'd just say they don't really amount to more than par for a city of its size. So I'm going to give it a 4.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the other thing is it's sort of overshadowed by the cultural giants to the north, you Manchester, Liverpool. It's not got that standout cultural identity that those larger cities have got, or even it hasn't had movements like we went to Coventry, which is similar size. It had two-tone. I suppose it's got a smaller student population, less of a cosmopolitan migration. It's certainly one of the least cosmopolitan of the major UK cities. So perhaps that lends some explanation as well as that diffuse urban landscape. I agree with you. It can't be a high score because of that, but there's some really interesting features that you've talked us through there. So I'll be going marginally higher. I'll go 4.5. Gotcha. But I honestly I don't think it needs a Pret-a-Manger, Cafe Nero. What is Space NK and a Jigsaw? No. Leave it as it is. Hanley's fine. It's got Weatherspoons and a few bars, shops. Fine by me.
And a big shopping centre. That shopping centre actually is the car park is built on the site of Port Vale's old ground.
Oh, yeah, there we go. Don't listen to them, Hanley. You've got enough shops. We're now on to the urban landscape. Stoke-on-Trent is undoubtedly an industrial landscape. Could you give us a bit of the context for how Stoke has come to be?
Certainly, I think the historical context of how Stoke's been shaped is really important. A lot of the places we've covered recently have been markets or trading hubs or tourist centres. Stoke-on-Trent, by contrast, is a manufacturing and industrial centre. And this means architecturally, it's a city of kind of the 18th and 19th century onwards. There are certainly no Roman remains here. Practically nothing survives from the Middle Ages, except perhaps for Burslam's distinctive street plan. But we can certainly hope to see lots of remnants of the industrial age in Stoke. Like many industrial cities, the towns of Stoke sprang up very quickly as they experienced this massive population growth resulting from the expansion of the main industries, pottery, coal and steel. And this is definitely reflected in the age of its grandest buildings. There are multiple 18th century parish churches built to serve this growing population. The fact that the towns all grew independently and in close proximity seems also to have affected the nature of their civic architecture. John Stobart says that building large public buildings was the main way in which the Stoke towns asserted their separate identities. This in itself wasn't particularly unique, but I think perhaps the dynamic of local rivalry and competition was. After all, there must be a good reason why 14 new town halls were built in the area in the 150 years up to the early 20th century. And I think we should probably talk, coming on from that, about the Federation of Stoke, kind of the next stage in its development, and how that has impacted the city's layout and character. The most obvious feature, as we've talked about before, is that Stoke has no defined centre. Many people have picked up on this. Matthew Rice describes the city as feeling like a perpetual suburb. Hanley is nominally regarded as the city centre today, and there have even been proposals to rename Hanley to city centre. But to be honest, it hardly dominates the others, and it certainly doesn't feel like the centre of a major city. Nicholas Pevsner, the famous architectural historian, wrote that there's no real centre at all to the city in the 1970s, and even the 6 towns themselves don't all have separate local centres. Even Stoke-on-Trent, which, given its name and its position as the administrative centre and the home of the station, you'd expect to be the centre of the city, doesn't really even have a centre of itself, I felt, when walking around it. Pevsner said in 73 that Burslam was the only one which really felt like it did have a centre. Burslam itself, if we can talk more about it, is said to be the mother town, and it's the only one I could find any major historical writing about from the 18th and 19th centuries before the towns really started to grow. This is still very brief. It's just from John Wesley. He remarks twice how civilised the congregation of the inhabitants of Burslam were from when he preached there. And in more modern times, there's been a lot of urban renewal or attempts at urban renewal in Stoke over the last 3 to 4 decades. Much of the industrial fabric of the city is gone and has been replaced predominantly by retail. More specifically, factories, bottle kilns, foundries and mines, along with old terraced houses, have been supplanted by retail parks and trading estates. And you certainly get this feeling when you walk, say, southeast from the station through Fenton. Pevsner says that Etruria is the one place that any cultural traveller will want to go to, but that it's a bitter disappointment as all the Wedgwood warehouses and kilns had been demolished. The large Royal Dalton factory was left to rot and demolished in the last decade after a fire, while lots of grand neoclassical building facades have been demolished. One very good, extremely dilapidated example still standing is of the old Burslam Sunday School. Clearly very grand in its time, but it stands there with its large row of Doric pillars crumbling to bits. And I think that kind of sums up a lot of the character of Stoke, unfortunately, as it is today.
I'd agree with Pevsner about Burslam feeling like the one that's got the most convincing old market square layout, and it's got a nice collection of buildings. The town hall, for example, the Wedgworth big house on that square. I think you'd probably say the town halls are the major set piece edifices of any interest in the towns. I mean, certainly Tunstall's got the town hall and the library building. Fenton's a town hall, and that's really about it. The rest of it is that perpetual suburb. I suppose that the challenge I would make to the perpetual suburb criticism is I feel that it's got more character than some of the perpetual suburb of that sort of surrounds London and the southeast. You know, you think of some of Surrey, but I certainly recognise the sentiment, and so that leaves us really with a bit of a challenging urban landscape. I think it's fair to say, one with a lot of interest and a lot of potential, but one that's quite lacking. It's quite hard as a visitor to necessarily appreciate in the way that we have some other cities of its size. I think we'd have to say as well, a lot of it's quite run down. You know, Stoke-on-Trent, which you mentioned, there's not much there. Well, it's the Minster is quite an impressive building, but apart from that, fairly dilapidated. We're sort of getting into the summing up here, aren't we? So yeah. I'll give my score. I think there's potential for the urban landscape to be something really interesting, especially built around the potential individual character of these 6 towns, but it's not quite there, and it needs the investment. So for me, it's going to be 4.
So I think, similar to what you said, when you go to Stoke, you can get a sense, I suppose, of up to now missed opportunity. Pevsner was really, in his summing up, scathing about the city. He called it an urban tragedy in 1974. And it's hard to say that all that much has improved since then. This is, perhaps evocative of Britain's transition from a manufacturing to a service-based economy where an urban landscape just hasn't caught up. With deindustrialisation, jobs for life have disappeared, just like the permanence of the factories they were practised in. You could, and some have, linked this loss of security and this urban decay with a more general political dissatisfaction, especially given that 70% of Stoke voted in favour of Brexit. To try and look at what's positive, the Garden Festival we noted before was a nice way to convert industrial wasteland to parkland. But there hasn't really been any real attempt at large-scale waterside regeneration, which has served other towns and cities so well. More specifically, Matthew Rice has noted the missed opportunities to develop old canal-side factories as, say, trendy flats like in other towns, which might have brought some life there. Much like in the culture category, I think what you're going to get out of Stoke is that same gritty urban realism in its industrial remnants, in its Victorian civic buildings, and in, I suppose, its modern devotion to suburban retail. You just have to take it how it is. And for all that, I think I'm going to give it a score of 3.
Our final category is reality versus expectations. It's not got a high expectation to me. So for me, it kind of sits where I expected it to, possibly slightly more interesting. So I shall give it 5.5.
Stoke gave me really no more or less than I expected. It's a post-industrial city that feels like a collection of old manufacturing centres dotted around an urban sprawl, with several diffuse cultural and political events, but nothing world-changing, with, of course, the one notable exception of its pottery industry. And I think that's key to this, because that does just about give it that claim to have been the one standalone best at something. There's that claim to uniqueness in something. So for that, it's going to hold its own in the middle, I think. It's going to be a 5 out of 10 for me.
Yeah, and I think it does come back to its state as that post-industrial city. And Daniel actually looked at some of the data on this before the episode, and it's still got one of the largest manufacturing sectors of any city in the UK. I think it's ranked 15th out of that 70 largest cities. 11% manufacturing jobs, so it's still there. But what's interesting is it's got one of the lowest rates of what we call knowledge service jobs and the lowest rates of high level qualifications. So that's its character. And one of the things it's ended up with is extremely cheap land and housing costs, and this is an opportunity. But it's one of the least cosmopolitans. And as you mentioned, it's sometimes called the Brexit capital. It's almost like the polar opposite of our previous episode, which was Cambridge. It's the other end of the spectrum. But this does provide opportunities. I mentioned it was runner-up in City of Culture 21. It was found by KPMG to be the most cost-effective place to set up a business in the UK. It's very well linked. It's got excellent road links, pretty good rail links. Been the second highest for job creation. And, as far as this podcast is concerned, hopefully an even better celebration of the fascinating pottery industry. Thank you, everyone, for listening and joining us for our tour of Stoke-on-Trent. If you have any feedback, please visit our website, yeoldeguide.com. Our Twitter is @yeoldeguide, and we'd love to hear from you. We hope you enjoyed our recent thematic episode on city walls. I know I had a lot of fun. We're going to do some more of these. What do you have in the pipeline, Daniel?
Coming up soon, I think we're going to do an episode on the very earliest origins of urban life in Britain. We're thinking of the earliest settlements that really could be described in some way as unified and urban. So I'm really looking forward to that. I've been doing some research and reading on it. It's a fascinating topic.
So this is when we moved from living in huts to making streets and houses. Is that what you're saying?
Kind of when we moved from living just on our own or within family groups to living in larger groups with some basic form of civic amenity or civic hub.
We look forward to that. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Ye Olde Guide. Don't forget to subscribe, rate and review our podcast. And be sure to tune in next time as we continue our journey through England's urban history. Until then, keep exploring. Bye for now.
Bye.